it is always good to spend time with family. Amen? Amen. So the year is 1968. I was 5 years old at the time. 1968. And what do you remember about 1968? You got married. 1968 was a bit of a bummer year. It was the year that the Wesleyan Church was formed. That's not the reason it was a bummer. That's a pretty cool. That's one of the good things that happened in 1968. It was also the merger of the Evangelical Brethren Church and the United Brethren Church and the Methodist Church. That was another thing that happened in 1968. That was the year that we finally, at the very end of the year, after this crazy, crazy year, on Christmas Eve, Apollo 8 was flying around the moon. And that was like the one highlight of just a crazy, crazy year. We were deep in the throes of the Vietnam War. It was the year that both Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy were assassinated. There were race riots at the Democratic National Convention. There were the infamous Watts riots. And we as a country were still struggling with this meaning of what civil rights meant. And then there were those people known as the hippies. 1968. A countercultural movement. It was known by the phrase, tune in, tune on, and drop out, a book made famous by Timothy Leary. Interestingly enough, though, when we think of the hippie movement, we don't realize that what this culture really was trying to find its place in the world, in a world that didn't seem to make any sense. It was a culture that was searching for spiritual meaning. Enter into this culture one Pastor Chuck Smith, a stern yet respected pastor in Southern California. Pastor Smith's church was dying. His church was unable to connect with the current culture. Just to kind of give you an idea, how many of you have seen the movie Jesus Revolution? Okay, a couple of you have seen the movie Jesus Revolution. So in this movie, Pastor Chuck and his family were watching the evening news, and the reporter was a thing on the hippie movement. And at one point, Mrs. Smith turns to Chuck and he goes, she says, "Boy, we really need to be able to help those people. They're in such need. They seem lost." And Pastor Chuck goes, "What they really need is a bath." And to this, their teenage daughter, who was sitting there watching the news with them, says, "Dad, that's the reason your church is empty, because you're judging people you don't even know." Chuck's daughter at the time was becoming very disenchanted with what the church was becoming. And after that conversation, she decided that she was going to go for a little drive. Well, on that drive, she passed by this hippie-looking man that on the back of his jacket had "Jesus Saves" with a picture of Jesus painted on his jacket. She had just ran into Lonnie Frisbee. Lonnie was excited to learn that this young lady came from a pastor's home, and she took Lonnie home to meet her parents. You can only imagine. Very stern Chuck Smith meets Lonnie Frisbee, and this is a bit like, he does not look like Mr. Roomy from The Chosen, but he looks more like, that's a picture of Lonnie Frisbee. And so she brings Lonnie home to say, "Hey, my dad's a pastor, and our church is struggling, and I think somehow we need to be able to reach people." And so Lonnie comes home and talks to Chuck about, or tries to. When he first rings the doorbell, Chuck opens the door and sees Lonnie there and shuts the door right back in his face. He rings the doorbell again, and he comes in, and one of the things that Lonnie said, I thought this was really interesting. He said, "My people are spiritual people." Speaking of the hippies, he goes, I was up in Haight-Ashbury. I was up in San Francisco, and I've been trying to minister to my people. Lonnie told Chuck that Chuck had the exact prescription for what ailed his people. But Chuck's church was a door that was closed because they didn't even care to understand this generation. It was interesting because Chuck repented of that. And the next scene, now the first scene that we see of Chuck Smith in his church is a man that's got a suit and tie on, suit, coat, and tie. And then the next time we see him, and he's preaching to an empty church. But the next scene we see is Chuck, and on this side are some of Lonnie's friends, and on this side, there's the church members. And he says, we got some friends in our church today, and instead of a suit and tie on, he had more like a leisure suit on. He had that with the nice, remember the wide lapels from the 1970s? Yeah, that's what Chuck Smith had on. And some of the church members, many of the church members were not much impressed, and they even pressure Chuck to change his ways. They said, "Pastor, they're going to get the carpet dirty, our new shag carpet dirty with their bare feet. They're going to get our upholstered pews all dirty. What are we going to do?" So the next Sunday, Pastor Smith is at the door, and as the young people are coming in, he's washing their feet before they sit down. Just like Jesus would have done. He says, "Welcome to church." And that day, as he's speaking to the people, he says, "We've got some friends in here, and we're going to learn about Jesus, about who Jesus is." And some of the church members, they said, "Pastor, we can't stay." They stood up right in the middle of service. "We can't stand for this anymore." He goes, "Well, this church is going to be an open church, and that door works both ways." One man and his wife got up and they left. A second man got up and hid with his wife and they left. And a third man got up, an older man. He got up, he got to the middle, he looked at his pastor like he was about ready to leave, but he came down, sat down in the midst of all these young people, and they made room for him. He goes, "Okay, Pastor, let's have church." And that experience, that launched what we now know as the Calvary Chapel movement. There are Calvary Chapel churches all over the United States, all launched from one pastor in 1968. In the tumult of 1968, it really, and the whole Calvary Chapel movement, what really started. I don't know how many, I'm a bit of a music geek, as you already know, but one of the first Christian bands that I was introduced to by my friends at our new church that we went to was a band called Lifesong. And Lifesong, now you listen to them, they're like, how in the world was this controversial? But back in 1970, Lifesong was very controversial. Now it sounds like very mild country music these days. But it was very controversial at the time. And the movement was born out of that. And as we watched the movie several weeks ago, however, it was the words of Chuck Smith's daughter. I tell you all that to say this, that it was the words of Chuck Smith's daughter that rattled around in my head. And today, again, there are people outside of our four walls who are spiritually seeking. They're not coming to church. We can collectively call them the nuns, meaning not nuns as in like a Catholic nun, no. But we call them the nuns because when they do a poll and they ask, what is your religious affiliation? They mark none. They're spiritual people, but they don't have any religious affiliation. And it doesn't mean that they're not seeking spiritual things. They are in many ways, I see a lot of parallels to 2023 back to 1968. It doesn't mean they're not seeking spiritual things, but unfortunately, sometimes we as the established church, and I'm talking about the church in general, not just the journey, we aren't even speaking their language, and even worse, we judge people we don't even know. And why do we judge people that we haven't even met? John records Jesus' words when he was speaking with Nicodemus from John 3:16. For this is how God loved the world. He gave his one and only Son so that everyone who believes in God, believes in him, will not perish but have eternal life. God sent his Son into the world not to judge the world, but to save the world through him. Isn't it interesting? If Jesus came to save the world and not judge the world, why do we think that's our job? Now, I know, I just made a whole bunch of you mad. You're like, what are you talking about, Pastor? It's okay. I think we've forgotten that we've forgotten that Jesus has commanded us to go into the world and make disciples. And far too many times, and I see Christians complaining about all the darkness around. They complain about the sinners and how the sinners are doing this and the sinners are doing this and the sinners are doing that. And we complain about and we judge, and yet we don't spread the message of Jesus. And I find it true. And you know, when I say this, I have to say this carefully, because you might think I'm pointing fingers at you, but I'm pointing 3 fingers back at myself. Sometimes we would much rather curse the darkness than to light a candle. And then there's sometimes we end up in a situation like John chapter 8. In John chapter 8, we are given the story of the woman caught in adultery. Verse 1. Jesus returned to the Mount of Olives, but early in the next morning, he was back again at the temple. The crowd soon gathered, and he sat down and taught them. And as he was speaking, the teachers of the religious law and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in the act of adultery. They put her in front of the crowd. Teacher, they said to Jesus, this woman was caught in the act of adultery, and the law of Moses says that we should stone her. What do you say? Talk about a loaded question. Jesus knew that if he said, have grace, they would stone him and they would throw him in jail. If he said, leave her alone, and then if he said, stone her, that meant she would die. But you know what? The Pharisees, unfortunately, were dealing in a half-truth here. Because you know what the law also stated? The law stated that not only was the woman to be stoned, but the woman who was caught in adultery with a man, that man was also to be stoned. So where's the other man? Where's the man? Ever think about where the man is in the story? Why didn't they also bring the man? Can I float a conspiracy theory here? We love conspiracy theories, right? What if the man that they didn't bring to judgment was one of their own? What if he indeed was a Pharisee and so it was a setup? Were they all about truth for the woman? Say, hey, this is the truth. We need to follow the truth. But when it came to the man, well, let's be people of grace. Well, let's continue. They were trying to trap him. This is what I was saying. They were trying to trap him into saying something they could use against him. But Jesus stooped down and wrote in the dust with his finger. Wouldn't you have loved to have been there? What in the world was Jesus writing in the dirt? Was he writing a list of their sins? Was he writing the name of the man that they didn't bring to be caught? To be stoned? We can leave it to our imagination. And they kept, in verse 7, they kept demanding an answer. So he stood up again. All right, here you go. You want an answer? Here's an answer. Let anyone who has never sinned throw the first stone. And then he stooped down. He started writing in the dust again. When the accusers heard this, they slipped away one by one, beginning with the oldest, until only Jesus was left in the middle of the crowd with the woman. Jesus knew their sin. He knew that they were judging the woman when they still had sin. And this is why Jesus spoke elsewhere about taking the log out of our own eye before we judge the speck in our neighbor's eye. Then verse 10, then Jesus stood up again and said to the woman, where are your accusers? Did not even one of them condemn you? No, Lord, she said. And Jesus said, neither do I. So grace, Jesus offered the woman grace, but then what did he say? He said, go and sin no more. And he told the woman the truth. Grace always has to come before truth. Grace always has to come before truth. Too many times we are in the place of the Pharisees. We are in the place of accusing, and like I said, I'm pointing fingers back at me too. So I'm not. This is not a message that's aimed. Somebody's thinking, oh man, he's calling me out. No, I'm not calling. I'm calling us all out. I'm calling us all out. So many times we are in the place of the Pharisees, those who are accusing and holding the stones, and we can't wait to mete out judgment on our faceless, nameless enemies. And the thing that happens is we forget that way back somewhere, and some of us were young, I don't know how much of a sinner I could have been at 8 years old when Jesus saved me. But one of the things that we forget is that all of us are sinners saved by grace. On our very best day, we are still sinners saved by grace. Pam's been reading a book lately called Messy Grace by Caleb Kaltenbach. He's not a handsome looking dude. Kind of reminds me of Uncle Fester from the Addams Family. I've seen a video. I've actually watched a few of his videos, and he's just kind of. But anyway, so Caleb has written this book called Messy Grace. Let me tell you a little bit of Caleb's story. Caleb was raised by LGBTQ parents. He had a lesbian mother and a homosexual father. How's that for getting things started, right? His mother was a lesbian and was in a monogamous relationship with a woman, and his father was gay and had multiple relationships. He was not exposed to Christianity. He was not exposed to religion. And at the age of 9, he was exposed. His moms would go out to pride parades, and they would see all these signs. And he says, what's making the Christians so angry? And so when he was a teen, Caleb decided he was going to join a Bible study, and the reason that he joined the Bible study was so that he could learn about what the Bible really said, so that he could debate Christians and tell them that they were wrong. At that very first Bible study, they were in the book of 2 Corinthians. Now, Caleb was not raised in a Christian home. He was not raised in a religious home, and so he was in the book of 2 Chronicles. And guess what everybody did? They laughed at him. But the leader said, hey, he said, no, we're not, we don't do that here. And thanks to that very patient leader, Caleb came to a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. I want you to know that Caleb's views are very orthodox when it comes to sexuality. He talks about this when he talks about his life, when he talks about growing up with two lesbian moms and a homosexual father. He talks about this idea that marriage is a monogamous relationship between one man and one woman in the context of marriage. He's very much within the bounds of Christian thought. And I bring up Caleb's name because he writes about this story of the adulterous woman, and two words come to mind when I think about this story of the adulterous woman, and they are found in John chapter 1, verse 14, one that we normally read a lot at Christmas time. And it says this, "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth." Do you know that the only person in this world who has ever been fully full of grace and truth is Jesus? Jesus was full of both grace and truth. And we struggle being full of both grace and truth because we tend to want to fall on one side or the other. I alluded to this last Sunday. So what I have in here, what you saw me picked up this rubber band, and what I have here is a rubber band. And on this side, we have the people who are full of grace. They're full of grace. Hey, that's awesome. Not much, it's flimsy, isn't it? On the other hand, we have the people who are full of truth. They're all about the truth. They're all about the law. Guess what? It's flimsy too. Watch what happens. When I take some grace, I take some truth, and I bind them together, what happens? What do you think this is? This is love. This is love. And you know what? Yep, this here, this leads to liberalism. This leads to, I wasn't going to mention this, but I'm going to say it. I saw something this week about the Sparkle Creed. And I'm like, what is this? And I looked at it, and I immediately was like, what in the world is that piece of blasphemous junk? But it leads to liberalism. It leads to anything goes. When we're just grace only, you know what? No, it leads to cheap grace. Unfortunately, this side too often leads to legalism. It leads to us being only rule followers. But Jesus says we need to be full of grace and truth. And we need to live in the tension between grace and truth. And let's face it, we already live in the tension of grace and truth. Don't believe me? We believe in one God, but he's three people. The Bible was written by God, but the Bible was also written by man. Jesus is fully God. Jesus is fully man. We're supposed to love God, but we're also supposed to love people. God is in control versus I have a free will. The tension is love. There's a tension between grace and truth, and there is tension throughout our faith. And so why should there not be a tension when we love people? And when we live in the tension, lives are changed. Back when we lived in Virginia, I'm going to share this. And one of the things that I find amazing is through our it's really hard to believe, this is our 25th year of ministry. 25 years of ministry. That's still hard for me to believe. It's hard to believe we have older kids, and our son-in-law is turning 40, and it's crazy. But it's been amazing over the years, the amount of people that God has put in Pam's and my path that needed grace, that needed somebody to just say, you know what? Tell me about your life. Tell me about what's going on. I'm not going to make a judgment. I want to listen to your story. I can name those. One of them was Nikki. Pam just befriended her. I've told Nikki's story before. Another was Candace. I've told Candace's story before. And it seems like over and over and over again, God has given Pam and I people who the established church has rejected. And not all of our stories Candace is my ultimate success story. We loved on Candace, And Candace is now just a full-fledged, oh, is she on fire, child of God. Nikki, not so much. But we took time to get to know them and took time to invest in them. So anyway, getting back to Virginia, Pam had to go to physical therapy. We seem to do a lot of this physical therapy thing. And she wore some yoga pants and a nice exercise shirt to therapy. And because the therapist got to look at Pam's chart, she found out that Pam was a pastor. And she informed Pam that she did not like Christians. They were not her cup of tea. One of the reasons is that many times Christians would come not dressed for therapy. Sometimes pastors would come in their dress slacks and their dress shirt and their tie for therapy. That's not how you go to physical therapy. Women would come in and they would come in for therapy with dresses on, and then they would get all crazy when their legs showed. And then there were the Christians who, without ever even asking anything about this woman, said, oh, here's a track. And they would call her a sinner without even taking the time to get to know her. Now, Pam stayed quiet during all of these times. She would just listen, and after several sessions, the therapist felt safe enough along Pam that she told Pam her story. Now, it's not a success story. I don't tell this story because, oh, praise the Lord, the woman came to know Jesus. We don't know. But one of the last words that she said to Pam when Pam left, was finished with therapy, she said, there's something about you. There's something different about you. You look at me different. Not with eyes full of judgment, but eyes full of compassion, eyes full of love. And that, my friends, is what the church, that's what it is to live in the tension of grace and truth. Let me tell you real quick about Candace's story. You've heard Candace's story before, but anyway, she was invited to church because her boyfriend's grandmother invited them to church. And they were excited. And we were in the middle of a series about what the Wesleyan church believes. And that particular Sunday that they showed up, now, Candace and Ryan were living together, and she was pregnant. They were not married. And they showed up, and I started talking about what the church, it was about some of some of the big ideas in the Wesleyan church. And I said something about, we believe that marriage is between a man and a woman, and that sex is only sex should only happen within the bonds of marriage. We're sitting there. Now that was a seed, because it was funny, because eventually, I feel like somewhere along the line, while Candace was at our church, she came to a saving knowledge of Jesus. But then what was really cool was, this was not the cool part, she was growing so fast, and she wanted her kids to grow fast, and we didn't have enough children's ministry to make it happen, and so they found another church. But Candace got excited, and one morning the pastor was preaching about the importance of being married, and they called me up and said, Pastor Dale, we need to get married right away. Would you still do our wedding? I'm like, I would love to do your wedding. And so I had a chance to marry Candace and Ryan. But it was just amazing, and it's just one of those stories that I was Grace. I saw how she came in. I saw how Candace came in, Grace. But yet I also said, here's the truth, and we need to live in the tension. And when we live in the tension, lives change. Let's face it. Caleb Kaltenbach writes, hear me on this, the church should be the first place someone would go for conversations like these. Yet for so many, it's the last place. Why in the world would anyone go to a group of people who would make them feel guilty or worse for what they are struggling with? Instead of going to church, they will go to other places to share their feelings and struggles. And a lot of places are not good, he says. Or if they go to church and just they can keep their secret to themselves, but they don't heal because nobody can heal from something they don't own. It's a sad state. So let's face it. If we're going to be the church, it's going to be a messy place. I would love for the church. I would love for our church to be a messy place. I would love people who come in here that they don't speak the way we think they should speak, and they might even let a curse word out or two. It's all right. Because guess what? If they're here, if we offer them grace and let them come here, they're going to hear the truth. I hope you believe that. I hope that you've been with me long enough that when I preach, you know that people know what it's all about. That it's about following Jesus. That it's about believing that Jesus died and rose and is coming again. And that we have to have a relationship with Jesus. So messy grace doesn't bother me. Seeing people come in, whatever, it doesn't matter what they come in. The church, it's going to be messy. If we're going to really reach people from outside these four walls, it's going to be messy. And their lives are going to be a mess. And I think it's fun because this is, like I said, over and over and over and over again, God has put in our path people who are messy, and we tend to come up to them. And what's really funny about that is we've been at several churches where when we cozy up to the messy people, the established Christians get upset. And like I said, not every story is a success story. But we have to live in the tension of grace and truth. And it's been my experience that most people already know that they aren't where God expects them to be. Most sinners know they're sinners. Most people deep down in their heart are not so arrogant to say that I've got my life all figured out. Yes, there are some people like that. But most people, they know there's something missing. They just don't know what it is, and they're seeking it in sex and drugs and rock and roll. Which is how the hippies, that's why I said this is so much like 1968. People are still seeking Jesus. They're seeking spiritual things in all the wrong places. And we have the answer. Caleb writes, finally, you've just got to love them and develop a good relationship with them, earn the right to speak, build enough influence in their life to earn the right to speak in their life so that when life hits the bottom of the barrel, you are the first people they will text or call, and you are able to speak into their life at that moment. And that's when your words carry the most weight. What's at stake if we don't? That's the main question we need to be asking, and the question is everything. The answer is, what's at stake? Their lives, their spiritual lives, their eternity, the potential they have of being a follower of Jesus. All of that's important. And so we must offer grace. And this song was